Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. In this episode, we talk with Art Dicker, director at R&P China Lawyers, a boutique PRC law firm that supports international business in China. He is also the director at Acclime China, which offers a complete suite of premium accounting and tax compliance services in China. Art has spent the last 14 years working in China to advise technology, manufacturing, and consumer companies on structuring their investments and managing legal risk in their operations. He has a deep understanding of the practical difficulties and cultural gaps faced by international headquarters in managing their legal risk in China, having served as Asia Pacific General Counsel at Cadence Design Systems for 6 years prior to R&P. Art speaks with us about the differences he has encountered between working in Shanghai and working in Beijing, the types of companies that are finding success in China, the nature of legal risk in China, the historical landmarks that help shape and form law in China as we know it today, data privacy considerations, China's corporate laws, and common mistakes foreign companies make in negotiating and drafting contracts with Chinese companies. Enjoy.
Foreign companies, they're used to their home market where things are clear, and the lawyers that they hire can give them a relatively clear answer. And we can't do that. And we're very honest about that. What we can do is we can tell you what other companies are doing. We can tell you what the regulators are trying to do based on a lot of times just an overall understanding of the broader macro policy goals that are going on here. You got to have a sense of what the government is trying to do overall as a strategy. You got to know what they're trying to accomplish, and then you can understand what risk might be a little more acceptable to take.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Art, welcome to the show. Good to have you on here.
Hey, Todd, it's a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. We go back quite a ways, back to the days in Shanghai, and you being a part of China Accelerator and the work we were doing over there, doing our mentor breakfasts over at Element Fresh and things. You had a lot of good times back then, and I want to get everybody else up to speed on you and your background. So let's start with an introduction of yourself and how you ended up in China.
Sure. Happy to. And so I studied Chinese way back in university, dating myself here a bit in the late 90s, when far few people were studying Chinese than today. For sure, people were still studying Japanese back then if you were interested in kind of East Asian studies. And then I came to China first in 1998 to do a summer language program up in Beijing. And I went back, graduated, came back again to keep studying with the Chinese for another year, and then didn't really know what to do after that, and kept punting on what to do with my life. And so I went finally, like everyone that doesn't know what to do with their life, they go to law school. So I went to GW for law school back in DC. Still didn't really know exactly what to do after that and what kind of law to practice and where to do it. So I knew I had a lot of school loans to pay off. So the best way to do that is to work at a big law firm, and went to New York. And I just kept having this itch to go back, to come back to China. I'd put in all that time to study the language, was still fascinated by the culture, the political economy, everything about the place, and couldn't shake that. And so my Chinese was super rusty. And I remember when I decided to come back in 2007, in between kind of slaving away on these, as a minion lawyer on these M&A deals, I was trying to find a tutor to help me get my Chinese back, and I could barely say a sentence. But when I did come back in 2007 at a different firm in Beijing, within a month, it all came back. So that just shows you the testament of having good Chinese language teachers and being in a natural language environment here where it's all around you. And so with that, I was I was kind of felt back in my proper place again, using everything I'd studied, all combined, and was in Beijing for 4.5 years, and then at a law firm, Morris and Forster, helping mostly foreign tech companies come here, American tech companies, and kind of got the itch, a different itch, to go in-house to one of our clients and kind of see what a company looked like from the inside, rather than kind of write these fancy memos and never know what happened afterwards. And so I went to a company called Cadence Design Systems, which is EDA software. So it's like super sophisticated CAD software that you use to design semiconductor chips. And was there for 6 years as the Asia Pacific General Counsel. Got to learn everything about the semiconductor industry, and left in 2017. Initially wanted to, I'd gotten an executive MBA along the way, and kind of with a couple other classmates, we decided to start a business helping Chinese companies go out and look for technology to acquire. We just ran into a lot of problems at that point, where these kinds of acquisitions became more and more political, and then just came back to law, and never really left. And so I'm now at R&P China Lawyers. It's a Chinese law firm, and it's similar to what I did earlier on in Beijing, where helping foreign companies, especially technology companies, come here, set up, figure out the regulations, and structure their investments and so forth.
You know what I'll tell you, people? If you want to have a significant inferiority complex and just carry that week to week, month to month with you, you should host a podcast and then interview extremely smart and well-initialed people along the way. And you will regularly feel nice and humbled. That's quite the background, my friend. Quite the background.
Probably a little too much background there.
No, it's amazing. Well, I mean, it was all important. It just, I don't think it was, the train had never slowed down once there. It was just accomplishment after accomplishment. I love how you just threw in, I just, picked up an MBA along the way. Like you were stopping for groceries on the way home.
I'm a lifelong student. I think that's what it is.
I'm a lifelong student. I just don't study. So, well, if books. I don't like the tests. I like studying and learning. I just don't want to have to prove I know anything.
Executive MBA, the E is for easy, not for executives. You don't have to, there's no crunching spreadsheets or anything like that. It's more the concepts.
I wanted to ask if you could, off the top, because I know you, like you said, you were 4.5 years at the firm in Beijing. Yep. I know you now have your firm down in Shanghai. Maybe at a high level, without predecessing a lot of the talking points that we want to get to, juxtapose the landscape now, and I'll forewarn our audience, or try to at least give some taste of why I'm asking this, is because Shanghai and Beijing, they have a bit of a rivalry. It's like a New York, LA rivalry. It's a Toronto, Vancouver rivalry, right? Like there's, you come back from a trip, gone to Beijing, and you come back to Shanghai, and people go, "How was your trip to Beijing? You didn't like it, did you? They were really mean to you, weren't they?" They want proof that Shanghai's better or Beijing's better. But from the legal landscape, maybe from a high level, what is different about Beijing and Shanghai?
Yeah, certainly. Yes, like on a personal level, you're right. I mean, I think everybody goes through that journey where a lot of folks like me, I had the choice a bit to come back to Beijing or Shanghai. The firm that I was interviewing at and went to had an office both places, but I chose Beijing because to me that was the real China, right? Like, I'd studied Chinese there all that time, and that was to me culturally like the center of the universe in China. And you had the hutongs, and that felt like the real China, whereas Shanghai was this, even back then was this major like global city that was, why would you go there when you're just coming from New York? It's just it's not that different in the sense that it's the international city, whereas and less Chinese, perhaps you could say. But when I was there for 4.5 years, from the business side, I don't know. I think Shanghai, all the multinational companies usually choose to set up their first office or their headquarters here. So I think it's just more opportunities here as well. Yeah,
I remember some of the what do they call the pollution apocalypses sometimes, to put it in perspective and just for our listeners who don't know how the gauge works, when you say it could go over 500 on the index, I would say on a really bad day in LA, you might be pushing 150. I don't know. Would that, and just trying to put it in perspective, maybe Vancouver, closer to where I am, a really bad day is about 30. So to put in perspective, when the AQI goes over 500 PM 2.5 AQI in Beijing, that it is dense and unhealthy at the same time. And that was one of the major reasons when I was moving from Dalian to Shanghai, the pollution and having a family and things that played a really big role in it. However, on the flip side, you're right. I mean, if you want true, you want to be in China, Beijing is the place. Shanghai is not necessarily China. It's one of the most metropolitan cities in the world. It's run by Chinese. It's in China. It is based on China. It has a phenomenal history of its own, but being so multicultural and intercontinental in its just shape and form, I don't think if you really want to experience true China that you would go to Shanghai first. You would probably go to Shanghai last.
Yeah, totally. It's a global city. I mean, if you go to Beijing and you try and speak English, right, they say "ting budong," right? I mean, they're not. You're not gonna have as much luck. But here in Shanghai, chances are within 30 seconds, you're gonna find someone around that can help you speak English if you don't speak Chinese. So it's just easier for all around. I think for foreigners to live here. Right. But then the trade-off, right? You don't maybe get the same experience, like you said.
Yeah, you can't go into the hutongs and it's more traditional. And would you say that is probably on par with the radius from Beijing, because Beijing is PRC central? So I think a lot of companies, I think a lot of C-level executives, they will have offices in Beijing. They will have residences in Beijing. They will spend a lot of time in Beijing. They may not keep their family in Beijing. They may not, spend their vacation, their summertime or whatnot in Beijing, but being close to and being identified and seen as located close to the central heartbeat of the PRC and the government is an important almost optic that a lot of companies want to have.
Yeah, totally. I mean, of course, like Beijing has Zhongguancun, right, where and Wudao, the neighborhoods up by the universities up there, Beijing and Tsinghua. And just to give a little more story, like when I was there studying Chinese, 20 years ago or so, like there was nothing up there, right? There was the universities and that was it. And then you'd go you'd take like a 5-minute bike ride up north of Tsinghua campus and you'd start to see fields almost. And now that's huge, like all the tech companies, Microsoft, Google, they all have like campuses up there and it just keeps expanding. And so if you're a tech company, for sure, you got to be in Beijing because of the ecosystem up there. And even if you're not, like you said, you got even consumer companies, right? Like they've got government relations departments, right? You got to be in Beijing to get a sense of what the regulators are thinking, because they're all there, right? On data privacy rules that come out, or new license requirements. Like you got to be there. We keep an office there as well, even though we're far bigger here in Shanghai. Just because the same reason we need to be in Beijing to have a sense of what's going on.
Because we've taken this conversation early on into a lot of talk about the cities and the infrastructure and things like that. I'm having one of the more nostalgic episodes, at least for me, that I've had in a long time. There's a lot of stuff that I miss. I miss the food. I miss the streets. I miss the little hole in the wall cafes. There's a lot of things that I miss. I love right now I'm sitting here. I love all cities there equally, except maybe Shenzhen, because it is just so hot and humid. It's almost unbearable. For those who don't know, Shenzhen, factory capital of the world, just outside of Hong Kong. Okay, let's move on. You work primarily with foreign technology companies coming to China. Now, I think a prevailing thought is that most tech companies are giving up on trying to do business in China because it's just such a difficult legal environment to try to figure out. What kind of companies you think are finding success there?
Yeah, it's a good question because for sure, like if you follow the media or even social media, right? I remember I put a post up a while back on LinkedIn talking about, foreign tech companies coming to China, blah blah blah, SaaS companies coming, and someone, a good friend of mine, made a polite comment saying like, can you name a successful, foreign tech company in China? And I think people think about all of the high profile failures, and people will say recently now LinkedIn is a failure as well. LinkedIn still has a huge, user base here, right? Now, maybe if you look at it as a percentage of the population of China, it's not huge, but it's still huge globally. And there are still recruiters here that are using them and using LinkedIn and finding ways to use LinkedIn to recruit for global recruitment needs, right? And so they have that base here. And if you and we can go down the line. I know you're even more familiar with these cases, Todd, than I am. The sale of Uber to Didi and all of that. I know it's hard to say that these are always failures. And I think the bigger point is for B2C companies. Yeah, okay, it is. B2C tech companies, it is tough sometimes. But what you never hear about are these enterprise SaaS companies, which no one has ever heard of, in the kind of the general public. But they're serving like a niche market here, for like supply chain management, for data analytics. And you don't hear about these guys, but they provide a service that a local company here is not providing. I mean, this is what we do the best in the US. We produce enterprise SaaS companies. I mean, that's really of course, there's other hard tech we're good at, semiconductors that I know as well. But what we're really good at is software. And there's still a lot of need for that here in China. And so we see those companies coming over every week. We see a new enterprise SaaS company expanding into the market here. Usually they're about pre-IPO or they just went IPO on NASDAQ, and their investors are pushing them to come here because it's a huge market. And so why are you not in China? And it's not time to be scared anymore. You got to go, and there's ways to make it work. And that's what we help them with.
How would you describe then the nature of legal risk in China, and how does that compare to the nature of legal risk elsewhere, North America, Europe, and such?
Sure. Yeah. So, when I went to law school, and you're trained in case law, right? And that's what the US and some of these other common law countries around the world are all about. You have precedents of cases which courts follow and are kind of binding on future courts. And you have Congress in the U.S. with all this legislative history. So you can see laws and the intent, right? Because that's key when you're interpreting it. Even the laws themselves are written very clearly with defined terms. I mean, there's lots of lawyers working there and making sure that everything is written very clearly. So there's always risk in the U.S. too, of course, being compliant with laws and so forth. But or other major economies in the Western world, and in China, it's part of it is things are evolving so fast here. Technologies and markets are evolving so fast. So in some ways, it doesn't make sense to write the laws so crystal clear because things change. I think ICP you mentioned is an example of that. For example, it's a perfect example. And at the same time, I think, of course, the regulators here want to have a bit of discretion. So the rules here are not 100% crystal clear when they're drafted. And you don't get the benefit of this congressional history to tell you what the legislature is thinking when they're trying to do this, what they're trying to protect, the interests that they're trying to protect, the risk they're trying to cover for the economy or society or whatever. So I think that's a different starting point. And when companies come here, foreign companies, they're used to their home market where things are being clear, and the lawyers that they hire can give them a relatively clear answer. And we can't do that in many cases here. We just can't. And we're very honest about that. What we can do is we can tell you what other companies are doing that are similar to yours, whether they're local or foreign. We can tell you what the regulators are trying to do based on a lot of times just an overall understanding of the broader kind of macro like policy goals that are going on here. So I know a lot of people say this, but it really is true. You got to kind of have a sense of what the government is trying to do overall as a strategy. And then, and data is a perfect example of that recently with the rules that came out, or ICP again. You gotta know what they're trying to accomplish, and then you can understand what risk might be a little more acceptable to take and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you got to take risk. You got to take it eyes wide open. And it's a big market. If you try to cover every risk possible, you can't even do business here or anywhere for that matter. So I think there's more risk here, but you just have to accept it and cover your bases as best you can.
I wanted to ask a question that I was ruminating about leading up to talking to you about the history of the legal system, thinking of North American and European law, thinking about the Magna Carta, thinking about the rule of law that typically governs and I think just gives at least a lot of us in North America, this sense of security in that if something happens, we can always go and sue them or something along these lines. And it got me to thinking, I wonder what the historical major implications, right? Where did law come from? It wasn't obviously adopted from a Western perspective, although they've brought, I think, a lot of it closer. I know a lot of, contracts and from the investment side of things, a lot of it has been, best practices have been borrowed from Silicon Valley as China over the last 25 years really started to spin up a lot of investment in tech as well. But is there maybe a bit of a historical, I'm not asking, I don't know if you're any kind of historian on Chinese law and where it came from.
Yeah, well, I'm a historian, but not necessarily about.
Yeah, if you could comment to maybe just what you know of how China law grew up and became China law as it is today.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it.
Thank you.
Chinese law is civil law as opposed to common law. So again, like the big difference there is common law, which started in the UK back in like the feudal lords, 500 years ago or something. That was based on case law. Like I said, courts decided, and then they set the precedent, and they kind of fill in the gaps where the laws are not clear as when they're passed, right, by the legislature, and that's common law. And then there is civil law, which is where literally, just the legislature passes a law and everything is self-contained, right? So everything is there that she's supposed to need, and courts decide cases. But when courts decide cases, it's not necessarily binding on a future court. Like the parties that go in front of the court, they can say, hey, there was this case 3 years ago, which is similar to our case. So we think it's persuasive that you should do the same thing, but there's no sense of like the judge has to follow that case because of, another court or a higher court made a decision that way. And so that's the starting like basic framework. And then kind of the historical context is, I think it has a few sources. It comes from Soviet, if you want to go way back, like Soviet era law, maybe as a starting point, as well as I think a lot of German law was kind of civil law code was adopted. But you're right. Nowadays, it is still a civil law system, but a lot of the inspiration is coming from other countries. So back in 2008, there was a big revision to the labor contract law, where China prior to that did not have a lot of protection for employees, and it totally flipped the switch. I mean, that law in 2008 was much more, kind of French style or European style of worker protections and severance and all that kind of stuff. So it was a total 180, and that was the inspiration for those changes that they drew from European sources. Most recent example, which I'll finish the question on, is the Personal Information Protection Law, which is the new law that came out late last year. And it definitely draws inspiration from GDPR in Europe. And there's a lot of similarities because that's best in practice as far as, and they're not going to, they're not going to write these laws from scratch now because they've seen what's worked and what hasn't worked arguably in other places. So they're much more sophisticated about drafting these laws these days.
Is there an opportunity that exists in China more than other places for the law to be influenced? I think in North America, we potentially naively believe that the law cannot be influenced. It is written down in books. It is black and white. There are precedents, and that we have an understanding that we can always trust the law to rule fairly and equitably when asked to. I'm wondering, would you say the same about am I even right about North American law in the first place? And would you be able to say the same about law in China?
Well, let me stick to how companies work, where sue each other and enforce stuff. So for sure, once you get outside of the major cities, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, maybe not even the second tier, but like the third tier cities, you're definitely dealing with less sophisticated courts, and the judges, they don't have as much experience. They're younger. And the older judges maybe didn't even have like formal legal training, although I think there are far fewer of those folks still in the system these days. And so that's something you have to deal with, whether you're a Chinese company or you're a foreign company. If you've got a complicated commercial dispute, you're going to run into the problem of just, the judges may not have the experience to deal with your case well. And so, but in Shanghai and Beijing and like I said, Shenzhen, these places are very sophisticated on IP protection. You name it. They're usually seeing pretty much every kind of commercial dispute, and the judges are really quite professional. And we often advise our foreign clients coming here to actually choose China as the place to do their contract enforcement. Like in a contract, if you're a foreign company and you have a Chinese counterparty here, because it's a cross-border contract, you can actually choose which law you want to govern, and you can choose where the parties have to go, where the court has to be that they go. It can be in China or it can be out of China. So you have a choice, but even in those situations, we still tell them in most situations to actually pick China, because first of all, like the courts are much more sophisticated here, like I said, than before. So you're not necessarily dealing with that problem anymore. And even on like kind of the bias problem that people perceive that there's like a home court advantage here, again, like in the major cities where most of these foreign companies are located anyway, you're not really going to see that anymore. And so you're going to get a pretty fair shake when you go to court here, even as a foreign company. So there's only disadvantages to choosing outside of China sometimes, because the company you're going to sue may not have any assets outside of China. You can win in court, but you might not be able to get at any of the assets they have easily. So what was the point of doing that then?
Great point. Is it becoming, or has it been, or will it be? I'll just kind of cover all the future, past, present. Could it be prohibitively difficult and expensive, etc., for companies, especially foreign companies, to comply with all the new regulations coming out of China? And I'm especially thinking about what you mentioned about the data protection and data privacy stuff.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, because we get that a lot. And, people also generally have this conception that that the new China data laws are super onerous, and there's all this extra work that they have to do, and it's something totally new they need to wrap their head around. When that's if they're already a global company, like usually most, even let's say North American companies, when they come to China, they've usually already set up in Europe, so they're already familiar with GDPR and have a starting point to work on, and it's not like this Herculean effort to try and understand the law here. If you're familiar with GDPR, if you already have like privacy policies built around that, if you already have a process internally to capture data, process data, get those consents from users, and store it locally if you need to, then it's not so different when you're coming here. Yeah, for sure there are different requirements here, but it's not like you're starting from scratch. And so I think that's one thing we get people a little comfortable with. And then the other big misconception that I see a lot, again, sticking to data, is this: everyone thinks, I think Tesla made the decision, right, that all their data would be stored here. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. No, not necessarily all legal that's driving that. But then people, extrapolate from that, and they're like, okay, so then all companies have to store their data in China. And that's not true, actually. It depends what industry you're in, depends on the volume of data you're collecting. Is it personal? Is it just non-personal? That's a huge difference. And so, it's not, again, to my broader point, like, it's not necessarily this huge burdensome requirement that everyone initially thinks it is.
One of the biggest challenges for foreign companies that we've heard about or seen listed by other organizations surveying their membership has been IP protection. Is that still the case today in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, like, touched on it a little bit already, but I think that, the example I like to give a lot, and other people certainly do as well, is they look at Japan. Japan, I think, back in the 80s and so on, maybe the 70s before that, had this image of being, just rampantly stealing companies' IP and not having a great system to protect IP and all that. And then Japanese companies started having their own IP to protect, and protecting it just as much from other Japanese companies as they were from foreign companies. And the same thing kind of happened in China. So, over time, like, China in the beginning was obviously like very deficient in kind of core IP, and over time has been developing its own. Huawei is a great example. Huawei has tons of patents, right? And you can go down the line of other major tech companies here, and they're fighting each other over copyrights and patents and trademark infringement cases. So when they do that, they kind of raise the bar for everybody, including foreign companies here. And the courts are not going to be like, oh, well, you're Huawei or you're Tencent, we're going to give you special treatment. It doesn't work like that anymore. The system is better for everybody. Kind of the rising tide has lifted all ships. And so I think the situation has improved dramatically on IP protection. It's not perfect, for sure, but it's not as big of a concern that foreign companies list as they, like, on those AmCham annual surveys, as they used to.
Let's move on to your firm and talk about the kind of work that R&P does. So if you could maybe start with an explanation of what kind of work R&P does do.
Sure, yeah. We are a Chinese law firm, but we're a bit unusual in the sense that the vast majority of our clients are foreign clients. So we're a full service firm. So I'm not trying to plug us in an advertisement here too much, but we're a full service firm so that we can handle kind of any cases, including like litigation and stuff. But we're pretty focused on foreign clients. So I think that's what makes it a little different. But I mean, like I said at the top, what I'm doing at the firm is very similar to what I did when I first got to China, working at an international firm. And so we've got a broad range of consumer experience, manufacturing experience, tech as well. So we cover all bases, and we're a good mix, I think, of foreign and Chinese lawyers kind of working together to give a good experience to the client. That's my marketing spiel, all perfectly memorized. Before you, Todd.
That's too funny. China's corporate laws are often short and vague. Not that I've made an effort to read a ton of them, but that's what I understand. How do you deal with that as a lawyer educated in the U.S., where laws have, and I apologize for saying this, but just endless pages of defined and redefined terms, congressional history, common law, case law, precedents to know, in helping guide people on how to actually comply. How do you juxtapose and deal with the two sides of that?
Yeah, it's a good question, because when we get clients coming over, they're they're trying to do business knowing that it's vague and initially frustrated with that. At the same time, they got to come here, as I mentioned, because someone's pushing them, the investors in their company or the market, if they're public already, the analysts and so forth. And so they've got this push to come and figure it out. And so in some sense, like where there's a will, there's a way. And I think what we do for them is try to find a way for them to comply as best as they can, with the laws being gray, with the structures being like a little bit unorthodox. If you ever heard of these VIE structures, for example, people look at them and they're like, what the hell is that? And it's this thing that Chinese companies started off using, listing to get around some of the investment restrictions here for foreign companies in tech. And then other tech companies, foreign tech companies use them as well. So there's these weird structures that they might have to get themselves familiar with, get comfortable with, and it's all to deal with these rules which are a bit vague and not what they're used to seeing, and that's what honestly makes it fun. That's what makes it fun, because if I was still back in the U.S. in New York, I'm pretty sure I'd be miserable just being a corporate lawyer there. But in China, you really have to be, and I know this is cliched a bit, but you have to be like a cultural interpreter just as much as you have to be a lawyer. You have to, first of all, you have to be able to read and speak Chinese, especially at this day and age. So one of the things that I pride myself on a bit, not to pat myself on the shoulder too much, but like you got to actually get into the law itself as written in Chinese and not translated for you, and know the words and know the distinctions between different terms in Chinese and what the connotations are and all that stuff. Because we're really, a lot of times we are kind of guessing, as educated guess as best we can, what the law itself is trying to do and how our client can comply. And the last thing I'll say about this is, like, I also say this a lot. What we're trying to give our clients is a story. Because I said nobody can perfectly comply with these laws, especially because they're so vague. So what you're trying to do is you try and come up with a story where you have done as best as possible to comply with the law as it's written and as you understand it, and we can help you understand it. And so that if you are ever challenged by someone, a regulator or your competitors, more often will flag you to the regulators if they don't, if they want to mess with you, then you got to have the stories like, look, we're complying. This is how we're complying. This is how we interpreted the law. We know the law's there. This is what we think is okay to do. And we talked to legal counsel and we got this advice and blah, 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 blah. Versus like being like, what are you talking about, Willis? Like, from back, whatever good times or whatever that show was. It's like, you have no idea what they're talking about, right? And that's just not going to work here at all. We're saying it's vague. We threw up our arms and just plowed ahead. So that's what we try and help our clients with.
I always knew that there was just something that might be a little bit off with you, Art, in the fact that you just said you like some things about law and you actually enjoy it. I mean, there's my answer. There's my answer. It's law. You're not supposed to like law. Nobody's supposed to like law. It's not likable.
No, we go into it by accident, just like I did. Like I said, most people don't actually want to go to law school. They just don't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah, I don't. I never had that thought. It's funny because actually growing up, I did want to be a lawyer, but then I realized how much work it was and how much reading was involved. Not just reading, but you actually had to remember what you read and then repeat it in some form. And I was like, well, that's not for me then. Although I do quite a bit enjoy arguing, so maybe I could have been a court lawyer of some degree.
You would have been a good one, I think, Todd. I'll give you that for sure.
I think I might have done okay. It's always been a dream that I just thought, you know what? If it wasn't for my darn ADHD and lack of emotional control, I might have been really good as a lawyer. What are the most common mistakes you see foreign companies make in negotiating and drafting contracts with Chinese companies?
Yeah, cool. Good question, because I think a lot of times people come here and they feel like they need that perfect kind of contract where they've won on every point in the contract. And, there's like a lot of times people will say, well, in China, the contract is not worth much more than like the paper it's written on kind of mentality. And So a Chinese party may just let the foreign party kind of put in whatever terms they want. The foreign party's like, wow, we got a great contract here, we're ready to go. And the local party and the local company in China is like, okay, good luck with that one, right? If you actually need to enforce it. Because again, like I said, they'll put like dispute resolution clause, like they'll put it in New York. That's great. Sue us in New York. We don't have any assets in New York. We don't have any assets in the US. And if you win in the US, you got a judgment from the court, nice piece of paper, bring that to China, you can't enforce it. You can't enforce it because there's no treaty recognizing judgments from the US into China. So your judgment is worthless, basically. So you spend all that time drafting a perfect contract for home court, for a court in your home turf, you win and it's worthless. So that's I think the idea. That's one of the most obvious kind of common mistakes that I think foreign companies make. And I just think, also just in general, relying on the contract, right? We see a lot of these, whether it's venture capital contracts for investment, or we see, joint ventures where they put in a lot of like these veto rights. The foreign party can veto these kinds of decisions. That stuff does not necessarily matter if you don't control the chops, if you're not the legal representative of the company, and you don't have senior people here on the ground. Forget it. Doesn't matter what kind of veto rights you have in the contract. That's also not valuable if you don't have real operational control here on the ground. So these are the kind of things I see a lot in mistakes in making and drafting contracts.
Going back to my comment about something being off with Art, I think you and I and all of our listeners know between the two of us who's the one that's just a little bit off, and it's definitely me. I really appreciate this, man. This has been a pretty fantastic episode. I know that a lot of people should probably get in touch with you. I'm actually, and I'm not lying, I'm staring at an email of a founder who has been approached by a venture firm who wants to help him expand into China. He's got reservations, not sure how to happen. Can I help? And these are the types of things where I would want to direct somebody to go and potentially talk to you. How do people get in touch with you? How do people follow you, your podcast, anything you're blogging? Tell our audience how to follow, get in touch, and absorb everything about Art Dicker.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Appreciate it. First, super grateful to come on your show. I'm an avid listener. I listen to almost every episode, so a real thrill to come on. And I do have a podcast as well. It's called Ganbei, and so you can just search on Apple Podcasts or wherever, Ganbei, Ganbei, and we talk about cross-border business and so forth. And for work, I'm at R&P China Lawyers. You can look me up on our website, rplawyers.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way. Just ping me on LinkedIn. I'm super active there as well. I'm happy to reply to anybody that's got a question or needs just some initial advice. Always happy to talk.
Art Dicker, director at R&P China Lawyers, and an old friend of mine, mentor at China Accelerator and the like. Thank you very, very much for coming on the show today. This was actually a lot of fun. I probably had more fun, and the audience will notice me being a little more glib than usual. This was a blast. Had a great time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co. And be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见.